making the space, the spaciousness for new work to be made. The space that Stephen, wherever you are, built, and what it invites. Every project kind of begins in response to an experience, and I think then that experience of the space kind of pushes back, and there's a path and something comes from that. But I would say that you've been incredibly generous in making a landscape that I would call landscape of permission and condition for new work. And I know I'm not the only artist here that has benefited and learned from that. But I want to say that the other landscape of permission comes from my friend Ann, and that every project begins, and really you have no idea what you're doing. And that goes on for really a long time, as many of you probably know from your own work, and that it's really important to gather around you what I would call the landscape of those things that help you trust whatever process and path that you're on. And that when I sometimes wake very early in the morning and have read poems from Anne's new book, The Door, it isn't that I can say exactly what those poems mean, but I know that a recognition is touched. And so how do we follow and trust the recognition that we sense and pay attention to that and try to bring it into some form of articulation or knowing? And so it was really beautiful, especially in the last poem, because you're asking the poem what it can do, right? And what are the words that we need, perhaps, and what the words can be made to do. And so I'm going to ask a really stupid question, okay, or like a really simple one, which is...
They're always the hardest.
They're exactly. But it's like, so where does it begin? Like, what words do you know to pull from the air? And I want to take a little phrase from today, because there's so much about light and time and hand, and your hand is moving the whole time that you're reading and bringing us with you. And there's a line where you say, light dilates evening. So think about that light dilates is to open, but evening is darkness. And so that word dilates, light dilates evening, like, I go, yes. But can you talk about where things begin? The origin? Okay, an impossible question.
Well, it's an interesting question because I actually don't know the answer to it, and I'm trying to think. Sometimes it's a phrase that comes into my head when I'm doing something else. So I'm vacuuming or I'm doing whatever one is doing, and a little scrap of language lands in my head. And if that scrap of language has sufficient energy to get me to stop doing what I'm doing and maybe write it down, and it has to have sufficient energy to cause the next thing to happen.
You say you have the words gather words.
Yeah, so if it's just, it's a very kind of, maybe it's even intuitive at this point. When I started writing, I would write these phrases down in notebooks all the time, and sort of, it's like catching,
Yeah.
like catching words out of the ether. And as time's gone on, it's those phrases have to be energetic enough to cause the next phrase to happen. And if they're not, they're just dead things. They're just little scraps, so you leave them alone. But when there's an energy, then there's a following that happens almost immediately. Like it has something else that it is going to. So then I often think of myself not as the writer, but the follower. So I'm trying to see where the language is going. I mean, it isn't spooky and it's not mystical, and it does take a certain amount of control, and it does take a certain kind of revision. Yeah. I wonder how you think about revision yourself.
I don't actually think about it. But I want to revision. I mean, the thing is like when I make a piece, it's not even a thing until it's open already, right? And so then it's like how you use the word following, I would use the word finding. That the process is one of finding, or the beginning is like licking your finger and like trying to pay attention to what comes to attention, right? And then it's the same thing as energy, like what comes to attention, is it something or nothing, right? Is this something I can turn over? And the turning over of it is often something that actually does happen in language, right? So how many ways can I name this thing that's happening that I'm sensing? But revision, like I think about in writing, revision is endless, or like it's always imperfect, at least mine. But I think when I'm like making a piece, you don't have time or chance to do that in the same way you might reorder a line or a sentence. Yeah.
So, but maybe we share this idea of attention, which I recently understood. The etymology of attention has this really beautiful little idea of stretching toward is in the etymology. I like this very much, this idea of stretching. So it's not passive. The attention is not a kind of it's not entirely receptive. It's also active, and it's this kind of dialogue between the receiving space and the acting space. I think you and I share this interest in this very pivotal moment between those two things. I think because you're so connected to place, and the aura of, or the meaning, or the thing that's potential in a place, that's part of what makes your work so moving, is that it's always claiming its awareness or attention to place. And my work doesn't do that at all. It's actually kind of the opposite, because it's sort of going into a place of placelessness. There's an interesting kind of tension between these two notions of, sort of in some kind of fundamental way, the space-time continuum. So somehow I feel like I'm on the time side of space-time, and you're on the space side of space-time. But we're both really interested in where they meet, or how they meet, or what happens there, so that they're not a dualistic place. Well, we know that. Sorry, we all know that. But it's always interesting to try and for me anyway, whenever I use the word time, I'm always aware that I'm leaving out space. And I was thinking earlier, I don't know, I think it's another question formulating itself, but I think we share this this interest in the non-narrative, in which we construct something that doesn't have a narrative. Well, in language, it's almost impossible, because it's always going to be a narrative. But by narrative, I mean this idea of the people that is beginning and middle end, right? So I think you also are invested in the non-narrative world.
Yeah, I would say that I don't also begin with a story, like when I put things into relation. It's like things are what they are and how they are what they are. If there's a narrative, it's in that. And I think the thing about attention is that in terms of attention being active, that it's how do you create what I call spaciousness to pay attention to where your attention is drawn. Because of course, like the wet, your feet in the grass in the poem fragment, like it's that you could pay attention to that or not, the stone that you find. And so, the process for me, it does come from the space, right? So it's like coming here and saying, well, there's like qualities of the space. There's all these qualities of light. And so you become very aware of time when you're in the space, because there's never a moment that's like any other moment except the one you're standing in. And so, then that has to work on you, right? So you want that back?
No, I just want to ask you, just as you were speaking, where did the coats come from in relation to the shifting light?
She always asks the hard questions. So, like, I had some of these coats, and one of the things I did was I was thinking of all the ways I could name what this space is. It's an inside and it's an outside. It's a volume that is empty or full. Like, what are just all the descriptors? And I was thinking about that it's a human-made thing in a forest that is a grown thing, and that took me down the grown-made path. What is making, what is growing, how are they the same? And but then I was thinking about it as a kind of chapel or sanctuary in the woods. It's a place set aside. And so I looked up the origins of the word chapel, and they go back, as you did with the word attention. The word chapel goes back to a coat or a covering, a cloak. And so to be covered, to be protected, to be in a space that's set aside. And I was thinking about the coats as the first architecture of the body, and so when I read that history of the word chapel, and I had these coats, I was like, well, there's a reason I'm thinking about the coats. It's like it let me trust that. And then there's the fleece. So I would say I've worked with sheep a lot. So the first sheep were you read the poem Greed. The first sheep were live in a space with the budget of the project laid on the floor and a bed of honey. So an animal and a human economy. And it was 800,000 pennies laid into a skin of honey, and the sheep were in the back. And so you walked in and you could smell the sheep and you could see the copper.
Smell the money.
You could smell the money. But, interestingly, pennies are not a legal tenure over a certain amount, so you can't pay your taxes in pennies and clog the system. But so sheep are dependent on human nurture. And so there's this mutuality of dependence. And I think in this, it's like also the raw and the cooked, the tailoring of the coat and the effort of human making and the season of growing. And those things sit within each other side by side, as we do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
And where did you find the coats?
Where did I find the coats? There were a couple of old coats of mine, friends, flea markets, thrift store. It's amazing what you can really find. There's an incredible cashmere coat in there that was, I think, $3. But they're found. But it's that point when you're looking for them. And some of the fleece that's very light is a churro fleece that comes from the Southwest. Some of the coats began in a project in Portugal, and I worked with farmers there and the different breeds of sheep. And so that's why there's the different qualities that they each have. And then they were stored in a very hot warehouse because we couldn't afford to ship them. So the ones that came from Portugal had a lot of moths living with them for quite a long time. And so what happened is they were partially eaten by the insects, and you can still see the residue of the like moth eggs and everything in them. And I was like, perfect for the woods, because it's also that they've invited a third process. And I think that because we both, I think, trust process implicitly. I feel like sometimes things need, just like attention needs sometimes three things going on. You vacuuming and doing other things, and then the phrase arrives in some way like a gift. And I think, like, in terms of physical processes, I feel like we have this rule in the studio is like, if it hasn't gone through three processes, nothing has happened. And I don't know, it seems to actually be true for me in working. So I feel like, oh, the moths, which everyone would be terrified, like, oh, the moths. I was like, yes, the moths. They have done their work, and you really do see that when you stand close to some of them.
I'm sort of curious about this idea of three processes, because I think for me in writing, I need to have probably three elements, or it's like a constellation of objects or ideas or memories, or the poems never come from a single. They never come from or nor are directed back out at a single. It's always this plural idea, and that's very. I think we're very alike that way. This idea that the
In relation.
Yeah, in relation. I mean, that's a kind of truism now. This idea of relation, but there is something to be said for being willing not to settle for a priori simplicity or simpleness about the world, right? Which is what I call literalism. So the more you can do to kind of make whatever you make accommodate the multiple or the diverse, or the different processes, the more I think you make something that has the potential of reaching the other and striking some kind of awareness. I'm uncomfortable with the word meaning, but just this idea that if you include enough, then what you make is more likely to include others. And if it includes only one element of your own being or your own life or your own observation, then you're really going to have somebody, you're always asking somebody to recognize you. And I think my entire life, all I've wanted is to make work in which that's not what happens, that I'm not the subject of my work. I don't want people to come to me and think about me, Anne. I'd rather they think about you, Anne.
Or the poem. Or the poem, or what something has become, right? And yeah, I mean, I agree with you that I think that it's also like that there's a sense for me of like suspension in these things we can describe in very literal, concrete terms materially, but it doesn't mean that what they make is literal. And so, and then trusting that there are those, what I would call layers, that then can well up, and they can each have their own attention. Yeah.
I was going to say something like, they can each have, I mean, this is rather fancy, but they can each have their own veracity. Yeah. Like there's a kind of veracity. I mean, one of the things that's so moving about your work always is that sense of veracity. I don't what I mean by that exactly. It's a sort of confirmation of this is this, and it isn't something else. I mean, it's almost a contradiction to what I was just saying about. So the veracity of the this is this has to come from. It's like a kind of funnel shape. So the scanner is in a goes way out and around, makes a big arc. In order for the this is this to happen, there has to have been the arc first, and then you come to this thing, and there's just this recognition.
It's very particular.
It's very particular of this veracity, which is, I guess, another word for truth, but I don't like the word truth. So I'm gonna stick with veracity.
I mean, I'll stick with veracity with you. So years ago, I don't know if we had met at that point. We had just met. And I was doing the project Susan referenced at Dia had carpet, an undulating carpet of the tail hair from horses, and you walked onto it. And I remember being there, like a day or two after the opening when you're totally exhausted, and a journalist walking in kind of going, "What's the horsehair mean?" And I was just like it so took me back, because I was like, it's an oceanic spread of this material, and I was just like, the horsehair means what it is, and all the things that it actually is. It grows from the inside out. It holds memory. It holds cellular memory. It comes from an animal and all the ways the animal uses its tails and all the things that we do to animals and to horses. And that didn't satisfy her. And I thought that was really interesting, because it was as if that material couldn't be itself, but it had to stand in for something else. And I don't know why we do that.
Well, it's sort of a great comment, because it seems to me that one of the truisms about, if we could make any kind of assumptions about an American sensibility, it would be of confusion and anxiety around the difference between a symbol and a thing that is itself, right? The isness of the is. So there's this sort of desire, this anxious desire for your horse hair to be something else. And so it symbolizes something. And you're saying, no, it doesn't symbolize anything else. It is what it is. And that if you could really engage that isness, then you will escape actually the literalism that destroys us. But you can't. But the way to escape the literalism is not with symbolism. It has to be in another venue. And you're so brilliant at that kind of insistence on the. Thank you.
Not wine or water.
Oh, I feel like I'm religious suddenly. Oh, I guess I want water. Too bad.
You're going to get a wine now.
No, it's so fun. I just had some wine. It was delicious. Probably the best glass of wine I ever had. I think I should remember always after a poetry reading to drink wine instantly. It's a very good thing to do.
Or maybe before.
No.
I want to say something. So, a couple of months ago, Ann and I had a conversation, and I was beginning to think, you never know what a project invites from you. It's thank you. Two-fisted drinker.
Never thus.
And I was talking to Ann about the work I had been doing with stone, and that I had an idea about a project that would be in this piece with stone, and that in some ways I was saying, Ann, will you be my words? And you were like, that's not how I think about language. You were very clear. And I was like, oh shit, she's like, that means I have to do it. And it was a long, long time in coming, because I kept writing down on a piece of paper, what can a stone bear? And I think for you, it's like, what can a page bear? What can words bear? And Anyway, so you pushed me to do that on my own. And in a process where working with wonderful stone fabricators in Madison, Wisconsin, we've found a process where I think instead of something feeling like it's been done to the stone, it is a process where it's like the language has maybe grown from or emerged with the stone. And that's maybe even more important than the words themselves, but how they are in their materiality.
But the language on this stone that weighs so much, that's not found language. It's quotations, isn't it?
Is a quotation found?
Yeah,
It's found.
right. But can you say where those
Where do the words come from?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't write it. I have one line, I think, in it. So I think for me, everything I read is like you may have phrases that word or that phrase and how it sits together, and it's like touch. Recognition is almost like touch. And so this stone carries sources from 3 different texts. One is by Emerson Ritter, who was a biologist who early in the last century was one of the first biologists working in California to really come up with a theory of biology as systems and the world as a web. And so way before we had that language, he was looking at the interconnectedness of things. And he has this night, the approaching night, and the night. The first and last lines and some of the middle come from this beautiful essay by Helen Keller, where she's describing the sensuousness and the beauty of the world that she experiences as a person who cannot see. And so it starts with the hardness of the rock, and it ends with the flow of curved and straight lines, which is overall things. So the human are the lines, I think, overall things in many cases. And then sprinkled among, sort of fragmenting some of her words, there's a discussion of Ovid and the way he talks about time in Susan Stewart's book, Poetry and the Fate of the Senses, which is a book that I have read many times and learned much from. And so it's her kind of condensation of Ovid in some way, some direct quotation and also some synthesis, and that's the other part. And then I have a few things that I threw in. That's where it comes from. So I would say that's found more than quotation. Yeah.
So maybe this is obvious, but one of the things when I wrote to Ann and I said I can't quite tell whether we're so much alike that it's almost impossible to do anything because we're just like in this alignment, or we're so dissimilar that we kind of don't know how to proceed. Like, what is our process? We're always trying to find a process. It always is much more confusing than it ought to be. But one of the things that recurs to me, along with our interest in the temporal as a non-sequence, and the way in which the temporal claims space. So we share that, a kind of a temporality that's spatialized. So that's where my hand movement is all about, spatialization of the time. The other thing that I think we share in some kind of really at the level of the genome or something is the notion of touch and the notion of the tactile. And it manifests itself completely different, because with me, the touch always has to be one way or another a metaphor or simile, and with you it's an actuality.
I mean, and I think as long as we're bodies, we will be touching things.
So
And
we all, excuse me for interrupting, but I think we're moving into the interrupting area.
we're moving into questions and everyone getting a drink.
Everybody wants to touch the fleece on the wall up there.
Really?
Yeah. Or at least I think so.
You do. Yeah, that's interesting, huh? Like,
Yeah.
oh. Yeah, the qualities, like the really, so there's a particularity, right? The particular words and how they work together is like, the qualities for me of the fleece and the touch of those different animals.
So that's the syntax of the kind.
Yeah.
You also speak about, in your book, art making you want to touch it, which I think is very fundamental to what you do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, why museum? And it's so hard in museums, you can't touch things. Yeah, but I like my work to be touched. Yeah.
Do you want to ask if there's any questions?
Are there any questions?
Yeah, I'm interested in the different ways I looked at your work. When I went in on the ground floor, I was up close and I saw the folding of the fleece and the close-up kind of tactile stuff. And then I went up the stairs and I saw the whole set of them, and then the wall appeared behind it. So do you look at your work in multiple ways?
Yeah, like from what you're describing, the different perspectives that you have depending on where you're standing in the architecture. Yeah, I mean, I initially thought about that upper space as the choir loft. I was like, where's the choir? What's the choir? And I think the coats are the choir, but now they're also the altar, I suppose, if you use that structure. And that you just see them in different ways, like it's near and far. And I think that's partly the whistling of the record. That's a sound that is actually about crossing a distance that's maybe greater than your sight, right? And so the whistling is in there, and it's also, I think, to go back to something you said about atmosphere and the feeling of being in a space. It's like how are you invited to allow yourself to just spend time? Yeah. Yes.
What did you do with the third process piece, the barbas and moths? Did you leave them to thin?
Wait, I didn't quite hear you.
Did you leave the moths?
Oh, what we do with the moths? Well, when we brought them back, we had to put everything into a freezer, right? So to kind of stop the process, because they literally disintegrate all the hair, the threads, yeah.
And with the freezer,
So every museum, like when museums bring them in, there's a set of coats going to an exhibition in Los Angeles, and they're like, well, we have to ship this in time because everything has to go into a freezer for 3 days before it's allowed to even broach the threshold of the museum. Yeah. Anybody else? Questions? Everybody? Yes, one more. Hi.
You both speak of the time
Oh,
space
yes.
when COVID hit, one of the it basically imposed upon everyone these conditions suddenly, and one of those elements was a complete dissolution of the time space continuum. I'm curious to hear from each of you of how that affected your creative process and how you found yourself in those conditions.
Yeah. I'm embarrassed to tell you that for complicated reasons, although I was conscious of COVID being horrendous, for me it was sort of normal in the sense that I like being alone. Because I've lived through 2 pandemics, polio and AIDS, I was not freaked out and terrified the way almost everybody I knew was. I did not wash my shoes before I came in, and I wasn't lazy and I wasn't stupid, but I just went on with my life and then felt, this is really shocking to say in a way, like really, really glad that my natural instinct to be in my head and in my world was joined by millions of others who would then discover the pleasures of solitude. And so so it's terrible to say. It's not like I wasn't cavalier, and I didn't think of it as permission granted or anything. I just noticed that the move between my life and COVID life was very slight, whereas for others it was phenomenal. And I have to say that if I lived in a city, it would have been different. But because I don't, it was easier for this to be true. But it is funny that I went to the same stores. I wore a mask, but I went exactly to the same little places that I go to get this and that and everything. It seemed so, it was just like a little bit of a form of communal freedom or something. I'm sort of outraged that I can say that, because we're not supposed to even acknowledge that. But that's how I felt.
I would just say really briefly that we happened to be working on projects that actually they were all full of words. A 900-foot long stone walkway that's the new entrance to the UCSD campus. And we were in the middle of that composition and that research, and so there were 3 of us in the studio, and we kept working. And to not, we were just obviously privileged that we had work and we had something to focus us, and we had, I thought it was wonderful to stay home, to be less traveling, to how much Zoom actually has allowed us to be connected, and to only, and travel less, and except when we really need to be present. And I think that's the big thing, that I know I can't make work unless I have walked a space, been in a place, felt its presence. And so, now I'm more out in the world. But yeah, I think that we just kept working.
The kind of short answer also, Sue, is that, just to make it clear, is that it was permission for a kind of interiority. So not necessarily solitude as much as the understanding that we can be inside of our minds and our thinking and our being and our receiving and our attending. It can happen, and it doesn't have to feel like a deprivation. So that was the thing, and I thought, well, maybe this hideous thing that's happened will maybe even allow, like students, for example, to discover that they have interiors, and that's valuable. And not I'm not talking about a romantic interiority. I'm just talking about being able to consult your inner world without feeling embarrassed that you're doing that. Because I think the externalization of our experience is so huge that the fact that you have an inner life is scary for people, and they don't know that it's okay to have an inner life. And to consign the inner life to the dream life is ridiculous, because the inner life is actually a form of thinking and a form of being and a form of responding. It isn't just your secret stuff. It's something much more, well, you know this, of course, but it's something that humans are endangered. We're in danger of losing that. And I think a lot of the way Ann and I both proceed is because we have a kind of capacity or desire, or I don't know what you want to call it, a tendency to respect that interior space, which is also classically affiliated with intuition, right? With an intuitive space as opposed to a judging space or a rational space. It's a sort of like, when Ann talks about process, it's about following an intuition about what has to happen. No, what might happen and what has to happen. And so you get yourself into these places of decision making which are much more interesting than the ones that come from the outside in, right? Because they're all telling you what to do and what to think and and all that. I mean, it's so easy to fall into these very canned things. So I apologize, but so solitude for me is the permission to to know the interior, and to acknowledge it, and not be embarrassed by it, right?
I'm just going to say one sentence.
Somebody over here wanted to say.
So I was just going to say that it's like, it allows, you have to let things well up, right? Like, and it's allowing the welling up. So, good. I think, are we at a good place? Everybody? Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you.